Yes, in the next couple hours, we're covering World War II again with Glenn Flickinger. First, with author David Chrisinger, who has written a recent book about Ernie Pyle, retracing Ernie Pyle's World War II footsteps. And then in the 9 o'clock hour with Dave Holland from Australia, who is the expert on the walking the battlefield of Guadalcanal. And I have a kind of funny anecdote to share about that. But let me turn it over to Glenn to introduce our next guest.
Right. Thank you. Thanks very much. Wow. What a long day of a lot of great stories so far, Todd. Been another fantastic event put on by the Veterans Breakfast Club. So thank you. And thank you for permitting me to take another bit of time here to talk about one of my favorite characters in World War II, someone that I've followed all of my reading career, Ernie Pyle. And David, I hope you're with us.
Yep, I'm right here.
There he is. Hey, David. It's a pleasure to meet you in person, finally. Yes. We talked on the phone and a lot by email, but thank you for being on tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I know you've been traveling, so it made it doubly difficult to figure out the time frame, but appreciate you hanging in there.
Oh, it worked out. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, great. Todd, do you and David know each other from any previous
I don't. No. But although he's a brother in spirit in the sense that he's a Ernie Pyle fan, and I wrote a biography of Bill Malden, so the two of them.
Okay, that's how I recognize the name.
Yeah, that's how exactly. And I got to know Ernie Pyle really through Malden. I think Malden called Ernie Pyle something like a wizened piece of misery in World War II or something like that.
That would make sense.
Yeah, that would make sense.
It was at the end of the war when Ernie was killed, and right. Bill Malden said that, you know, when a soldier dies, his friends miss him. Now that Ernie's died, the whole army misses him.
The whole army misses him. I mean, he spoke for people who really had no other voice during World War II. And it's heroic work that he did and Malden did during the war. So I'm so pleased that you're joining us, Dave.
Thank you.
Two very similar, well, obviously not similar men, but they certainly had a similar impact on the war, let's say, and on the home front especially, and on the soldiers, on the individuals. So David, first, let's just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're an English teacher. In fact, you're the 1922 National Council of Teachers of English George Orwell Award winner.
Yeah, that's right. I
watch my grammar tonight.
I promise that's not my prerogative. Well, I run we call it a writing workshop at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. So I work with graduate students and I teach them persuasive writing and writing for advocacy, writing for policy, that sort of thing. And by the way, just a little aside, Ernie Pyle is a tremendous advocate for the soldiers and has given me lots of great examples that I can use even to this day. But in addition to my work at the University of Chicago, I also lead writing seminars for a nonprofit called the War Horse, which is a nonprofit newsroom that works to tell stories about the military and about the veteran community. They like to say that, you know, we spend about $1 trillion a year on defense and veteran spending, but those topics get less than 2% of coverage in the media. So the War Horse is there to try to sort of tip those scales a little bit more in the other direction. But I came to Ernie Pyle sort of in a serendipitous way. When I first came across him, I remember the exact day. It was Memorial Day 2016, and I was on the island of Okinawa. And you might be wondering, well, why was I on the island of Okinawa? Well, my grandfather served in the 193rd Tank Battalion, which was attached to the 27th Infantry Division, which fought during the Battle of Okinawa. And like a lot of men of his generation, a lot of the men that Ernie wrote about, they weren't big talkers. They didn't like to tell their stories for a lot of different reasons. And so my grandfather passed away going on almost 25 years now. without any of us really understanding what he had experienced. And so as the kind of family historian, the only one with graduate training in history, I took it upon myself to dive into the archives and really try to piece together his story. And the kind of ultimate experience was I was going to Okinawa to retrace the steps of his unit during the battle. And I hired this local historian that helped me around. And at the end of the day, he took me to this memorial called the Cornerstone of Peace Memorial. And it is this breathtaking memorial to the about 260,000 people who were killed during the Battle of Okinawa. And that was, the Japanese defenders, the Ally invaders, and the Okinawan civilians. 260,000. I mean, so if you've been to the Vietnam Wall, right, that's what, 59,000 words or 59,000 names. So just, do the math of 260, and there are these names carved in these very kind of wave-like granite structures. And so I was there with this historian. He said, we can do an etching of the name of someone maybe that your grandfather knew that died during the battle. And at that time, I didn't have that kind of granular level detail about individual soldiers in his unit. And so I, must have looked at him like, I don't really, don't have anything to say. And he said, well, don't worry, I'm going to take you to a name I'm sure you'll recognize. And so he took me to see Ernest Taylor Pyle etched on the wall. And I have to admit, and this is a little embarrassing, it didn't register with me. I didn't have a pre-existing, fandom for Ernie Pyle. And my first thought went to Gomer Pyle, which I remember watching Gomer Pyle reruns with my dad when I was a kid. And so I said, oh, is this somehow related to Gomer Pyle? And you should have seen this guy. He's giving me the same looks that all of you are giving me, which is, he looked at me like I had two heads. And he said, so let me get this straight. You've spent the last several years digging through archives, reading every book you can find, and you flew 7,000 miles to try to figure out what your grandfather experienced as a soldier, and you've never read Ernie Pyle? You got to be kidding me. And so he basically gave me that assignment. He said, when you get home, you have to read everything that Ernie Pyle has ever written. So I started with Brave Men. I bought Here Is Your War. Those were two collections of his pieces from the war years, and was just totally blown away. And with his ability to humanize his subjects, with the details that he would pick out, the sort of glimpse into the everyday realities that the soldiers were experiencing, what it was like to sleep in a slip trench, what it was like to have, trench foot, what it was like to eat K rations for, 3 weeks straight, what it was like to not bathe for 6 weeks, like all those, little kind of daily life details. He was so precise on, and it just so happened to be the kinds of stories that readers back home were kind of hungry for, right? Yes, they cared who was winning. Yes, they cared, what division was, retreating or advancing.
Fighting what battle? Yeah.
Right. But at the end of the day, they wanted to know, what's my son going through? What's my husband doing for food? What's my brother? What's it like for him in Italy versus in North Africa versus France, right? So I, was just sort of became an Ernie Pyle fan, read all the biographies, and, would preach to anyone who would listen about, what a great writer he was. And then fast forward a few years, this is 2019, I was working as a columnist for the New York Times, a contributing columnist for the At War column. And they were looking for pieces that had something to do with the 75th anniversary of World War II, specifically towards the end of World War II. And so I emailed my editor and I said, has anyone picked D-Day yet? Has anyone done 75th anniversary D-Day? Nope. Nobody's called it. I said, I want to write a story about Ernie Pyle. His reporting from D-Day was absolutely incredible. There's a whole story there. And my editor said, oh yeah, I remember learning about Ernie Pyle back in journalism school, but I don't remember what was he so great about, right? And so it was like the perfect kind of topic, right? Because he's that kind of character, that kind of person where people have sort of gone, oh wait, I think I know who that is. And then they're that more receptive to like hearing some kind of interesting tidbit about it, right? And so I wrote this article, and it came out the day before the anniversary of D-Day. And by, I think they said by noon the day of D-Day, it had over 1 million views. And it just sort of broke all their, clicks or views or however they measure that for that time frame. And it was supposed to just run online, but the paper saw that it had gotten so much attention, they decided to print it in the actual paper. Well, the next day I get a call, or an email rather, from an editor who said to me, "Hey, I read your Ernie Pyle article. I read that article you wrote about your grandfather and, retracing his steps through the war. If you ever want to write anything about Ernie Pyle, a book length thing on Ernie Pyle, let me know, because I'd be all over that." And I can assure you, if there are no writers in the crowd, that's not how it usually works, right? You don't usually get an email from the editor saying, "Please write this book for me." But there was, again, that thing that people kind of glom onto whenever Ernie Pyle is discussed, is that idea of, humanizing the subject and making people feel things, right? And making them understand something just a little bit better that was incredibly difficult for them to understand in the first place, right? And they'll never totally understand it, but they're this much closer. And so I got on the phone with the editor, and I said, I kind of want to do what I did with my grandfather, but with Ernie Pyle. I want to retrace his steps through the war. I had just finished reading a book called Confederates in the Attic, which the author had done something kind of similar to that. He became a Civil War reenactor to try to better understand the Civil War. So I thought, I'm going to become a war tourist. I'm going to go all over, all the places that I went to North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, to the Pacific, and, got to see these places, got to see the places where Ernie was, retracing his steps, following his columns. And I also got the really incredible privilege of having access to a lot of his personal letters that he wrote to his wife, and that he wrote to his editor, and that he wrote to his best friend. And so the job of writing the book really became more of like a carpet weaver. I had all these sort of different strands that I had to start tying together, because there was the story of what Ernie reported, right? And then there was the story of what we now know all these years later, right? What we know about the campaigns or these battles or whatever it is that Ernie couldn't have possibly known, or that, he was hoping turned out okay. And luckily it did turn out okay. But if it hadn't turned out okay, those pieces would have not aged as well, right? So there's those two strands, but then there were these three strands of Ernie's personal life. And he talked about his daily routines. He talked about his processes. He talked about how he was feeling, his health. He was very forthright about especially his own mental health, communicating with his wife and his editor especially. But when you have, his wife, his editor, and his best friend, Ernie's going to tell, different things to different people. And he's going to tell them things with different levels of detail. And so it felt like I got to sort of be on his shoulder, while he was hunched over the typewriter, really trying to understand what he was going through. And that's what I was most fascinated with. That was the most interesting question I wanted to try to answer, was how did he do it? Okay, so let's just put it into a little bit of context. When he died at the end of the war, Ernie Pyle had 14 million daily readers. He wrote a daily column. It came out 6 days a week. 14 million households a day had access to Ernie Pyle's column. He ran in 98 of the top 100 biggest cities in the United States. He had a movie was being made about him, a movie that ended up winning Academy Awards. He had these multiple books that came out that were bestsellers. He was famous. He was a
Won the
famous
Pulitzer Prize.
He won the Pulitzer Prize. He was I don't mean this derisively at all, but he was sort of a celebrity journalist before there were celebrity journalists.
So I put it one time to an audience I was talking to about Ernie Pyle. He was a rock star journalist World War II.
Totally.
And it's almost like every once in a while we have to go back and rediscover Ernie Pyle,
Right.
and remember how much of a rock star he was
Right.
during World War II.
Right. Absolutely. And
he also, and I'm just going to break in and just say, he also may have been the most read writer in American history, read by more people than any other writer we've ever had, because his career preceded World War II. Yes. He wrote during the 1930s, and he was very popular even before the war. So, and he was very accessible. He was in so many newspapers. You could say that more Americans read Ernie Pyle than any other writer.
Well, it's one of the differences I kind of find between Malden and Pyle is Malden sort of came out of nowhere, right? As things progressed. Pyle had a history, and that's where he helped me with this, David, because you're the writer, and Todd. He kind of practiced his art in the 20s and 30s, especially with the aviation. And the model of writing he used even in those aviation articles were traveling around the country, talking to people and writing about these people's experience. So it seemed very formative for him.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the thing is, like, when he became a correspondent, he was 42 years old, and that was his first experience as a war correspondent. He didn't have any overseas coverage. He wasn't an expert in military affairs. He didn't know anything about national security. He didn't fit the mold. Even he was a very small man, didn't weigh very much. He was very short. He was shy. He didn't like the sound of his own voice. He doesn't match that sort of rugged war correspondent off to
well, in your book there's a scene with him and Hemingway in a bar in Paris.
Yes.
I mean, he's no Hemingway in terms of what he looks like and how he comes across.
Right.
But exactly. Hemingway, in that scene you painted, you might tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So this was during the liberation of Paris. Yeah, this was during the liberation of Paris. And Ernie, at that point, was not really interested in being on the front lines anymore. He was perfectly happy to be back in the back rear guard of the action. But there were more enterprising and more adventurous correspondents like Hemingway and Don Whitehead, and you can throw in Robert Capa into that group. And there were several that were, they wanted to be out in the lead elements because they wanted to be the first to have their byline with liberated Paris, right? That was a big deal. And Ernie was like, I don't care. So, a couple days after the liberation, Ernie shows up, and he basically, his celebrity shines through, and there are hundreds of correspondents, Allied correspondents, all staying in this one hotel in Paris. And Ernie's hanging out in the bar in the basement, and everybody's flocking around him because he's world famous, and they all want a piece of him. And this is how, honestly, this was really good for me, because a dozen of those guys wrote about that, that scene. And so I got it from all these different perspectives. I could kind of triangulate and build this scene for the book, which as a writer is incredible to have that access. But Ernie's basically, surrounded by all these kind of hangers-on, and Hemingway, struts up to the bar, and nobody notices him, and he's not pleased with this. And so he, I say he bellies up to the bar, and he slaps the bar top to try to get the attention of the room. And the bartender looks at him, and he says, I'll have a drink here. I'm Ernest Hemingway, the rich man's Ernie Pyle. And that just, like, I think just sums up Hemingway in so many ways. But the reality was, like, everybody really loved him. They really did. And they all wanted a little piece of him, and they all wanted to be next to him or be written about by him. And that was because when Ernie wrote things, things happened. People stood up and listened when he said things. And the funny thing though is he looks like the most unlikely of war correspondents, but he has the pedigree that was exactly what he needed to be able to do the kind of reporting that he did in World War II. So I say his writing during World War II was actually like the fourth phase of his career. So the first phase, he's a copywriter. So he's got to write short, concise, snappy, clear, to the point. He's got to do this. And that's a skill that he's going to take into column writing, right? Where he's limited by 700-800 words, and he's got to get the point of the story in there as quickly as possible. So he's got years of chopping down everybody's writing so that it fits in the column, right? And he's got those skills. Then during the Depression, then he becomes a columnist, for the aviation industry, like you mentioned, and he's interviewing pilots. He's traveling all over the country. And when the war starts, some of those pilots are now high-ranking officers in the Air Corps. And so Ernie's getting access in some cases, or he's getting invited to, participate in different things. Once he gets to England, those relationships paid off for him. And then during the Depression, he was a roving correspondent, and he crisscrossed the United States 35 times, traveled all over South America, all over Canada, went to Hawaii, Alaska, and he wrote a column every day, 6 days a week. I believe, I'm going to probably butcher this quote, but I believe the equivalent, to tie back to a point Todd made, he wrote like 2.1 million words just in 7 years while he was crisscrossing the country as a correspondent. And that would equal about 31 books, about average length book, 31 of them, right? I mean, this just incredible output. So by the time the war starts, he's quick, clear, concise, snappy. He is familiar with aviation. He's done the sort of daring, the kind of sexy reporting, right? The sexy topics. And he's traveled the country and gotten to know tons of people, and he's been all over the country. And that's another thing you notice when you start to read his columns is he's able to say, oh, this looks just like the coast of Oregon, or this looks like the deserts in New Mexico, or this looks like, Western Texas. And he's able to sort of bring these places into, more relief for his reader. That was all part of his job as a translator, or as he would joke that he was just a letter writer. He wrote their letters home, and he painted one hell of a picture.
David, there's another aspect I'd love your comment on about Ernie's life. And I remember when I first read my first biography of him, I don't know, a long time ago. Then I read Tobin's biography, and of course now yours, which is a kind of a different type of biography. Anyway, his personal life, his marriage, his mistress, his drinking, his mental issues, all predated World War II and the issues he had. It seems to me, well, tell me, how did that his personal life impact his writing?
Well, in the early part of the war was actually kind of good for him in some ways, because during the North African campaign, there was very little alcohol. It was very hard to find. You could find wine, he said, but he hated wine, so he wouldn't drink it. So he had to kind of go cold turkey. He was a heavy drinker. Lots of people, in that time were. Newspapermen especially were known to be heavy drinkers. And even when he would sort of say he was cutting back, it was like, just 3 whiskeys after dinner, it's that sort of thing. But he was a heavy drinker. He was also, I would say, he was depressive, right? He would have kind of ups and downs, not manic depressive by any stretch, but just, times when he didn't really see the point of anything anymore. But he had this wonderful relationship with a woman named Geraldine, who everyone called Jerry, where they, both wanted to live the life of a roving correspondent, and they both kind of liked that non-traditional lifestyle, and they were a team in many ways. Jerry would rewrite Ernie's articles for him. She would edit for him. She would give him ideas for his columns. There's some suspicion that she might have written some of the columns. Ernie writes in a letter kind of cryptically, but basically saying if anyone should be the writer, it should be Jerry. She was a very talented woman. But as they got older, and as the time on the road was getting harder and harder, and not having a place to call their own, they decided to build a house in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And this is when his wife, Jerry, this is when her mental health really starts to decline. And I presented what I could find about the issues that she was struggling with. I told these to a couple of doctors, and both told me that they would assume, and they're not diagnosing, obviously, because it's impossible to do that from all this time and distance, but they said it sounds like she had manic depression. And so she would have these very high highs and these very low lows. They didn't know how to treat this illness for her. They prescribed her alcohol. They prescribed her barbiturates. They used electric shock therapy. The doctor even at one point suggested that Ernie divorce Jerry to shock her out of her depression. I mean, just stuff that we look back and we kind of go, oh my gosh, what were they thinking? And so in the early part of the war, it was almost like Ernie really needed the war. He needed something. He needed, he couldn't help his wife. He was feeling very low. The options for him were not great at that time, but he was really good at being a column writer. And that's what he could do. And that's how he could serve his country. And once his column really takes off and he becomes this spokesperson, so to speak, for the average soldier, and his popularity sort of grows and grows and grows, then it gets to this tipping point where suddenly he's like, oh, this isn't what I signed up for, right? This fame, all this pressure, all this, being under a microscope all the time, that's not what he was looking for. And so I say in the book that at the beginning of the war, Ernie needed the war. And at the end of the war needed Ernie. And their interests, started to diverge a little bit.
I've got a jillion questions. Maybe we ought to stop and ask if someone in the audience has a question, Todd, because I don't want to. I want to give them the opportunity to ask.
Yeah, I agree. Please do raise your hand, just, or put up your Zoom hand if you'd like, or put a question in the chat if you have a question for David. David, I put in the chat that if you're half a good a writer, I didn't read your book, unfortunately, not yet. If you are half as good a writer as you are a speaker, you should be winning the Pulitzer Prize for this book, because it is, I mean, you're just articulating beautifully the magic of Pyle's life, and
he's a better writer.
He's a better writer. That's one hell of an endorsement, I tell you. Yeah, he's a fascinating and kind of uniquely American character, isn't he? Yeah. I mean, a guy who comes from the prairies, rural community in Indiana, roams the world, roams the country and the world, but knows thousands of people, and is able to kind of see the world from different people's perspectives, and yet fundamentally a pretty lonely guy, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's true. He never seemed to enjoy any of the success that he was having. And I sometimes, when I think about unhappiness just in general, I think there can be kind of two different kinds. And one kind, I call it, I don't have a name for it yet, but the way to describe it is, what you're supposed to be doing, where you're supposed to be, but you're not there, right? And there's an unhappiness that you're like, oh, I should be doing this, I should be doing that.
Yeah.
Then there is the kind of unhappiness where you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, right? And so you're trying this and you're trying that, and nothing's clicking. And I think Ernie knew he was supposed to be doing something different no matter what he was doing. So when he was home with his wife, he should be overseas. When he was overseas, he should be home with his wife. If he's at the front line, he should be in the rear. If he's in the rear, he should be in the front. He just never seemed to find the place where he belonged and where he felt like he belonged there. But I also think that allowed him in some ways to kind of tap into the feelings that a lot of soldiers were feeling too, right? And the way that they were dealing with these same kinds of emotions. Ernie could put a story to that, and he could help people understand. Like there's one article that he writes in during the Normandy campaign, and he's with an infantry platoon and they're outside of Cherbourg, and this is, you know, during the final assault on Cherbourg, and Ernie is writing about these soldiers kind of running across the street in intervals so that, you know, the machine gunners don't open up on them. And he says, and this is just shocking to hear this, right? But he says, these boys are not heroes. He says they're not heroes. He says they're young men who 6 months ago, you know, had their whole lives in front of them, and we put a gun in their hands and put them on this street in Normandy and told them to do this thing, and all they want to do is get it over with and come home. Right. And just, you know, I got chills just even thinking about that, the way that he was able to say, hey, listen,
yeah,
it's not what you think.
Yeah,
it's this. And Malden did the same thing, right? Yeah. He did it in lots of different kinds of ways, whether it was using irony or you know, all the black humor and everything else. But Ernie just had a way of making people really feel something, even if they didn't have the same experience as the soldier might have had.
The title of your book is The Soldier's Truth. And that little anecdote you just told, that's one of the truths that he told. And it was a truth that a lot of Americans weren't ready to hear, didn't want to hear, had not heard before. And so I think his writing came as a shock to many Americans, but also familiar.
Yeah, well, and especially later in the war. I mean, he builds up to these hard truths, and I think he had to build a certain level of trust with his audience. Yes. Before he could deliver those hard. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you need some hard truth, right? Do you go to someone you trust, or do you go to some Joe Schmo on the street, right? You go to somebody you trust who is going to give it to you straight. And Ernie was somebody who was going to give it to you straight.
If I can make a point about his writing, you know, he could touch the mothers and fathers and loved ones in a way that maybe only Bill Malden did as well, right? And one of my favorite columns of his is a simple one. He said, I think it's early in the war. He's in North Africa or Sicily. I think Sicily. And he says, look, you want to understand what your son goes through? Go out in your backyard, dig a hole 3 or 4 feet deep, get your garden hose, fill it full of water. Now sit in it for the next 3 or 4 hours. And then put a backpack on, fill it full of 50 pounds of rock, and walk around for the next 3 hours. And then come back to that same hole and lay in it overnight and try to sleep. I mean, you don't think that's a Pulitzer Prize, but touched those loved ones so much. And I think that's where the trust was built for him to explain what these men went through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris Perlow. And I think Bill Malden wrote that, by the way, Glenn.
Oh, really? No.
Yeah, really? I think.
He wrote that? Oh,
I could be wrong. Malden wrote something very similar to that. Maybe Malden plagiarized Pyle, which wouldn't be surprising. Yeah. Chris.
Good evening, everybody, and happy Veterans Day. Just 2 weeks ago, by coincidence, at a used books sale, I picked up this book.
Oh, yeah.
Hard to see. It's Ernie Pyle, Here Is Your War.
Right.
And I'm looking forward to start reading it here. But 2 things. I want to read you something on the inside jacket here. Here is your war. There are really 2 wars, and they haven't much to do with each other. There is a war of maps and logistics, of campaigns, of ballistics, armies, divisions, and regiments, and that is George Marshall's war. Then there is the war of homesick, weary, funny, violent, common men who wash their socks in their helmets, complain about the food, whistle at Arab girls, or any girls for that matter, and lug themselves and their spirit through as dirty a business as the world has ever seen, and do it with humor and dignity and courage. And that is Ernie Pyle's war. He knows it as well as anyone that writes it better, and writes it better than anyone. That was from John Steinbeck.
Yep.
Tribute from John Steinbeck. Okay. Yeah. On the back cover here, you can't see this because I blur everything. Anyway, on the back cover, it says scenes from Ernie Pyle's The Story of G.I. Joe. Here Is Your War. Lester Crown production starring Burgess Meredith. and 500 GIs. Is this the movie you were talking about, or is there a different movie?
No, that's the movie.
That's it?
And so there's an interesting story about how that came to be. So Here Is Your War came out, and the producer bought the rights to the book and said, I'm going to make a script, based around this book. But that book only includes his columns from North Africa. That's it.
Okay.
Then there's a second collection called Brave Men, which includes Sicily, Italy, and then France. And his pieces from Italy especially were so popular that the producers were like, hey, actually, can we have all those ones too? Can we have access to those stories? And that's where one of the main characters is based off of Captain Wascow, which is the subject of Ernie's probably most famous column. It came from Italy. And so when they made the movie, they re-released Here Is Your War with sketches that are throughout the book that are from the movie. So it's a really kind of cool second, re-release of Here's Your War.
Did Ernie live to see the movie?
No, he died right before it was finished. And in fact, they played the very first screening of the movie on Okinawa for the troops there during the occupation, so that they thought that would be the most fitting place to release it.
Do you think Burgess Meredith was good casting physically? And
I mean, he was pretty close.
Yeah.
I don't know who. I mean, there were plenty of actors that their names got bandied about, including Fred Astaire, which I think would have been a much much different character.
Hard to imagine.
It's hard to imagine. Yeah, Burgess Meredith, I think, was a good pick for that.
He was a young man then too.
Yeah,
he was, and he had to get leave from the army in order to do that. But Ernie had enough pull that he made sure that happened.
Yeah.
So I have a question for. I'm sorry. Was our guest done? Yeah,
our guest Chris.
Yes,
it looks like it.
Oh,
I have a
yeah.
question
You say yes.
for both Todd about Malden and David, and that's censorship.
Perfect. Great question.
So you touch on that several times in your books, both books, right? So, what role did censorship play for both of them, and especially for Ernie as he became so famous and so popular? Were his articles less censored than other correspondents?
There is a good argument for that. So early in the war, there was this was right after the French had surrendered and then joined the Allied side. And there was still quite a bit of animosity between the Americans and the French because the French had fought when the Americans landed. And Ernie wrote a column with the title, I believe it was called "There Are Snakes in Our Midst." And he wrote this column about how, yes, the French surrendered. Yes, we're working with them, but we don't trust them. Don't worry, we're going to keep an eye on them. And this was like verboten to write about. No way could you write about that. And it seems that the censors didn't read the column because they thought it was some human interest column that Ernie Pyle writes about foot cream or something. And so it got through. And it got published, and it caused quite a stir stateside. Well, after that, I think he was a little more careful. I think that was his one chance to get something passed. Now, generally, he knew the things that he couldn't write about, and so he didn't try to write about those things generally. But and there were certain things like you couldn't write about race relations. You couldn't write about if soldiers were upset with their officers. You couldn't write about that. You couldn't write about anything that could give aid to the enemy, right? Anything that could give comfort or that could be seen as fatalistic or defeatist. And that was where a lot of the subjectivity between the censors and the newspapermen and the reporters came from, where the newspapermen were trying to push what they could write. And the censors have no incentive to let them write anything that they're not supposed to be writing. And so what I think Ernie did was he found different ways of communicating the things that he wanted to communicate without upsetting the censors. And so he didn't write about anything that could lead to a defeatist attitude, but he would write 3 columns about how everything was going exactly as planned, and then he'd have a column where he was like, but, right? And so he would sort of build up this goodwill, right? And he also wanted to write more about mental health, and he got a lot of pushback from the censors, and that was the one case that I found where someone reported that Ernie was upset about a story being cut because they cut out a section where he described these 2 soldiers that were basically shell-shocked, and wrote it in a way that he thought was very sympathetic, but the censors were worried would seem, like we were like these soldiers were wusses or something.
Yeah,
right?
not tough enough, right?
Not tough enough, right? And then there's another story that, going back to Captain Waskow, the column that Ernie wrote about Captain Waskow, and this could be apocryphal. This was just one recalling of the event, was that the censor who read that column started weeping while he read it and passed it through without any marks. Whether that's true, I don't know exactly, but I think it speaks to the reverence that Ernie's writing probably commanded with censors, and they wouldn't want to upset Ernie because Ernie could just say, oh, well, I'm going to go over here then. I'm not going to mess with you guys anymore. And then, your unit wouldn't get as much coverage as you thought it was going to get or whatever. But he generally didn't try to pick fights with censors. He was more concerned about finding out new and interesting ways, I think, to communicate those really sometimes difficult truths.
And Todd, with Malden, it would occur to me that given his cartoons and the subtleties that one could have, he could communicate things that perhaps Ernie could not. Is that accurate?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Give us an example. What would be a couple examples?
There's one, and I could show it to you. It's a cartoon of Willie lying in bed, unbandaged. He's in a hospital, clearly. His eyes are open, and he's staring into space straight ahead. And he's surrounded by doctors and maybe some other officers. And one of the officers says, at least he could try to lie at attention. And that's the caption. And it's very clear that Willie, he's got the 1,000-yard stare. I mean, he's in the midst of battle fatigue. And of course, Malden can never say that. He couldn't mention battle fatigue like Ernie Pyle tried to. But he got it across in the weariness of the face, the staring of the eyes, the obsessive search for alcohol to kind of numb the trauma. It's all throughout the cartoons, and I think it got across to the audience without being explicit about it. And I think that was the trick that Pyle and Malden both mastered, was to get a message across subtly without upsetting the censors, without questioning the war effort or anything like that. But nonetheless, to get a message out about the suffering that's really occurring up front.
Well, and we should say too that like Pyle and Malden wanted the Allies to win the war.
Yeah.
Right. And so they were not incentivized to give any information to the enemy, or, they weren't there to be gotcha journalists or, blow the lid off of some corrupt, that was not their job.
Right.
And, sometime in the 1970s, especially, there were folks that called Ernie Pyle a cheerleader or even a propagandist.
Yes.
Right. That he cheerleaded the war. And I told that to, I don't know, a dozen people that I interviewed, and almost every single one said, no, he was a cheerleader for the soldier. And there's a difference. There's a difference between being a cheerleader for the soldier and a cheerleader for the war. Yeah.
David, this is such an interesting conversation, and it's interesting to trace, when did Ernie Pyle become unfashionable or unpopular? And I think it was during Vietnam. I think it was the counterculture, Vietnam War protests. I forget who the general was. I think it was a Marine Corps general. Didn't he say, like, he cussed out some journalists in Vietnam and said, like, you should have been more like Ernie Pyle, And I think Ernie Pyle got kind of tarred as being a propagandist when he really wasn't. I mean, he was certainly working within the restraints of censorship during World War II, but he was delivering, as you say, some important truths that the folks back home were clueless about.
Right, exactly.
Can I ask you? Could you tell us? You've mentioned it, and we've mentioned it a couple times, that the famous Captain Waskow column. Could you, for those listeners who aren't familiar with that column, could you describe it a little bit and say what makes it so famous and powerful?
Sure. So this Captain Waskow was loved by his men, and Ernie learned that he was loved by his men and how much he was loved by his men right at the tail end of the battle for San Pietro. And Ernie ran into some soldiers who were dealing with trench foot. They were kind of off the lines, and they were all obsessed and kind of panicky about the fact that their captain's body had not been brought down off the mountain yet. And like a day went by, and 2 days went by, and a third day went by, and one of those soldiers, trench feet and all, stole a mule, hiked up the mountain, found the captain's body, tied it to the mule, hiked back down, all with, incoming and machine gun fire and all the rest. And when they got the Captain Waskow, when they got his body down in front of this aid station, they laid him down in front of this wall. And Ernie is there watching as, soldier after soldier after soldier comes to basically pay their final tributes, to say goodbye to the captain. And Ernie records it very much like a fly on the wall might describe it, right? He tells us what the soldiers say. He paints a picture, it's very vivid, of the sadness and the grief, and also the fact that these men are going to dust themselves off and they're going to go back to the front lines and they have to move on. And and it's this very simple, quite short, but highly evocative piece that Ernie thought was junk when he first wrote it. He thought that he had basically lost his touch, was how he framed it. And so he asked one of his fellow correspondents to read it, and this guy's name was Don Whitehead, and he read it and he said, "Ernie, if this is the work of someone who has lost their touch, then the rest of us should just go home, because we can't do this." It ran on, the front cover of hundreds of newspapers. It was read into the Federal Registrar. It was used in war bond rallies. It, basically became, the column that Ernie wrote. And in fact, it was voted the best newspaper column of the 20th century. In the United States. So it was one of those that, like, anytime I talked to a reporter or a journalist and I said Ernie Pyle, he said Captain Waskow, right? I mean, it was just they're connected like that. And it's a piece that I think if no one's ever read Ernie Pyle and they read that piece, they go read more, because it's so powerful.
Yeah. And in the movie, it's a very powerful scene in the movie.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So Ernie Pyle definitely suffered from battlefield fatigue, what we call today PTSD.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair.
Did Malden have issues as well, Todd?
Oh yeah. Yeah, Malden had a lot of issues. And certainly he did absolutely suffer from PTSD. He greatly admired, as everybody did, Ernie Pyle. They became friends, you could say. Pyle had like an avuncular relationship with Malden. Pyle didn't have children, and Malden was about 20 years younger. So, and the fact that Malden was a genius from Ernie Pyle's favorite place, New Mexico, just sealed the deal that, and Malden was, clearly kind of doing in pictures what Pyle was doing in words. And it was a Ernie Pyle column in January 1944 that really on Malden, he said something like he teased readers back home saying the finest cartoonist of the war is doing cartoons here in the European theater. He's not syndicated back home, so you can't see these cartoons, but man, everybody loves them. And that just made Malden a celebrity overnight, and really, you could say a millionaire overnight, because he was suddenly inundated with book deals and syndication offers and movie deals. But Malden was wary. He thought that by the time he had gotten to know Pyle, that Pyle was over the edge. That Pyle had lived on the edge of danger, had lived on the edge of self-destructiveness, and Pyle was. I think Pyle spooked Malden. I think Malden thought, I don't want to become like this.
Yeah.
Self-destructive and almost suicidal in the sense, that, Pyle, Malden kind of begged Pyle to go home, to, not expose himself to such danger. But Pyle didn't really know any other way to do it.
And for our audience who's not so familiar with Ernie and the end of the war and his tragic death, David, speak to that a bit as we get here towards the end of our hour.
Sure.
Why in the world did he choose to go out there when he must have known, he was, as Todd said, on the edge of the cliff here?
Well, when he left Paris in September 1944, he left the door open for the idea that he might go to the Pacific. Well, once the Navy read that, the Navy was putting a lot of pressure on him to come to the Pacific and give that war the same kind of treatment that Ernie gave the European War. And, you can look back, the media coverage of the European War is enormous compared to the Pacific War. Lots of the battles in the Pacific are totally forgotten, right? It was not reported in the same way, and for a lot of reasons, and we don't have to get into those. But Ernie agreed, and he kind of island hopped, and he rode on a ship, and he rode on he rode on carrier, and he went over here and he went over there, and he felt like his columns were getting stale. Mm-hmm. They weren't interesting. Mm-hmm. And so he decided that he would go along on the invasion of Okinawa, and that would be his last invasion. And he wrote to his wife and said, "This is the last one I'm ever going to do." And then, if anyone knows the history of the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese changed their tactics for that battle. So instead of attacking the forces as they landed on the beach, they retreated to the southern half of the island and created these successive defensive lines. And so the landing on Okinawa on April 1st, 1945 was mostly uncontested. And Ernie saw that, and he writes this in his letters. He says, "Oh my gosh, this is a sign. I survived one more invasion, and I should never do this again." Well, 16 days later, he lands on a tiny island off the coast of Okinawa, and he's killed by a Japanese machine gunner. Now, we don't have anything that he wrote that said, "I'm really excited to break my promise to never go on another invasion, and here's why," right? We don't know exactly why he did it, but I think the best interpretation came from another correspondent named Robert Sherrod, who knew Ernie, and they were together during that battle. And he said a soldier must have asked Ernie to come along, because Ernie never turned down a soldier. Yeah. He never said no. Right. So I think that's probably right. That he had it in his mind that he was done, and then someone said, "Come on, Ernie, just one more, right? You got to see this thing we're doing," or whatever. And he said, "Okay, I'll come along for one more," and that was the last one.
And do I recall it correctly, David? It's been a while since I read the book. There was some misunderstanding about the reporting of his death.
Yeah, I think it's a symptom perhaps of, again, kind of what a celebrity he was, so that some of the early reports painted a slightly different picture of what happened than what probably happened based on the evidence that we have. And so I can lay that out really quickly. But when Ernie landed on that tiny island off the coast of Okinawa, he was wearing a tan uniform. This was verboten, no good, right? You need jungle fatigues. Nobody wears a tan uniform. So they threw a jungle coat over the top of him. He was also wearing aviator sunglasses. That was a no-no because it attracts snipers, right? So when he was killed, he was wearing a tan uniform and aviator glasses. And there is a picture of his body, and the photographer claims that nothing was moved. He was not posed. And there is just this tiny little trickle of blood coming out of the corner of his mouth. But otherwise, there's no evidence of a gunshot. And so what this one researcher tried to kind of recreate, and what I think sounds pretty plausible, is that when the machine gunner opened up on the Jeep that Ernie was riding in and they jumped out into the ditch, Ernie would have been, like laying against the berm with his head against the dirt. And then the machine gun rounds came through the dirt and basically knocked down all this dirt behind his head. And then, yes, that's the picture. So you can see that if he would have been shot in the face by a machine gun, that would look very differently. And so they think the round went underneath his helmet, and because it had gone through the dirt, it lost velocity, and that's why there's no exit hole. And so there's just the early reporting was that Ernie lifted his head up to check on the other guys and ask if they were okay, and that's when he was shot. Now, is that a difference that is so important? I don't really think so. I don't think it makes him less heroic that he got shot in the back instead of the front, but I do wonder what he was thinking wearing a tan uniform and aviator sunglasses when he would have definitely known better than that.
Oh yeah. I mean, he was as savvy as any frontline soldier.
Yeah. But that speaks to some of the, sort of self-destructiveness that he flirted with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you get the sense that he's a gambler with his own life by the end of the war. He may make it, he may not. And if he doesn't, then he'll be out of his misery. If he does, he'll keep going, doing what he's doing.
Right. I think that's right.
That's absolutely the sense that you get. And I have to just say, and I know this is not my thing, but about 10 years ago, I was in California and I interviewed some veterans. And one guy said, I think I was the last American to see Ernie Pyle alive. I said, really? He said, yeah. Said he was a frogman, UDT, underwater demolition team member at ESHA. He said, I'd just come out of the water. I was like getting out of this gear. A Jeep comes by with a driver, and the Jeep stops, and a guy gets out and says, hey, sailor, what are you? I've never seen the gear that you're wearing. You're a frog, And he said he got out a little notepad. And he said, I told him, and I knew it was Ernie Pyle, and I told him who I was and what we were doing, what frogmen were doing. And Pyle said, I want to come back and talk to you, and took down his name, went up ahead. And the guy said, just not long, not even an hour later, he heard that Ernie Pyle had been killed.
Yeah, someone put in the chat, it was like FDR dying. It was shortly after FDR dying, and it was, the whole nation
Grieved.
Really did mourn him. Yeah.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, Todd, even a little bit behind here. We could go on, I know, for another hour easily. And
David, what a pleasure to hear you talk about Ernie Pyle. You really inhabited him as a historical character. You understand, the pressures that he was under. You're so eloquent in talking about him and his war reporting. I assume that you're not a veteran. I assume that, like me, you're not a vet.
Right.
So you're learning about, war from the outside. And it's just amazing to me how much we can learn from these writers who are writing about these extraordinary experiences that most of us don't have. And you clearly did the work to learn those lessons. And I would just want to thank you for that.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate being here.
And David, I will give a ringing endorsement to your book. I don't think it'll make a nickel's worth of difference in the sales, but
Thank you nonetheless.
You can tell by all my little notes, it is just a well-written book, and very much appreciate you being on with us tonight. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Take care, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye, Dave.